All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to unpack a really complex but incredibly important area of the law. We're talking about the legal framework that's been built to protect vulnerable people from manipulation and exploitation. We're going to see how the law draws these super fine but really firm lines between what's considered trust, what's deceit, and what becomes outright trafficking.
So, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the absolute bedrock of all this, legal consent. Then we'll walk through crimes of seduction, see what happens when someone facilitates exploitation, and finally look at the full-blown business of human trafficking. And to wrap it all up, we're going to see what the punishments for these crimes tell us about what our society truly values. Okay, so let's start with the absolute foundation, the cornerstone of every single law we are about to discuss, the nature of legal consent. Seriously, everything hinges on understanding this one core principle. This right here is the question that drives this entire area of law. A simple yes seems pretty straightforward, right? But the law knows it's way more nuanced than that. It asks, okay, was that yes given freely? Or was it actually the product of some kind of deception? Was the person who said it old enough, mature enough to really get the consequences? Or, and this is a big one, was it squeezed out of them through an abuse of power? The law is smart enough to know that consent can be manufactured, it can be manipulated, or it can be coerced. And when that happens, it's not real consent at all. For our journey today, I want you to think about these laws in a specific way. Don't see them as just a random list of rules. Instead, picture them as a carefully designed architectural blueprint. Every article, every little clause is like a brick, a foundation, a reinforced steel door. And they were all put there with one single purpose, to build a fortress of protection around people, especially minors, to guard their dignity and their right to choose for themselves. All right, we're now laying the foundation and putting up the first major walls of that fortress. We're talking about the crime of seduction. And you'll see the law splits this into two very different categories. It's not based on the act itself, but on the method of attack. Was it a lie, or was it an abuse of power? First up, we have Article 338, what's called simple seduction. And I want you to notice how incredibly precise the language is here. The law is targeting a very specific situation. A minor, specifically between the ages of 16 and just under 18, who is convinced to engage in sexual intercourse. The key ingredient, the absolute heart of this crime, is that their yes was gotten through deceit. The best way to get your head around this is to think of it as the crime of the counterfeit promise. See, the offender isn't using physical force. No, they're much more subtle. They operate like a master counterfeiter. They create a fake promise, a promise of marriage, a promise of a future together, a promise of undying love, that to a young, impressionable person looks and feels totally real. But it's not. It's worthless. It's a lie, a piece of counterfeit currency that's being used to buy something that isn't for sale, a person's genuine consent. Now, to really understand any crime, legal experts break it down into its core parts. It might sound a little technical, but it's pretty simple. First, you've got the physical act itself, what lawyers call the actus reus, which is just Latin for the guilty act. Then you've got the offender's state of mind, their intent, the mens rea, or the guilty mind. And finally, there's the harm that the law is trying to prevent. So, for simple seduction, the guilty act, the actus reus, is clear: sexual intercourse with a minor in that specific age bracket. And it has to be achieved through trickery. But the harm? Oh, the harm is so much deeper than just the physical act. The law sees this as an exploitation of trust and a total violation of that minor's autonomy, their basic right to make informed choices about their own body. And just as important, it recognizes the huge emotional and psychological damage that comes from the betrayal of being so completely and fundamentally lied to. And that brings us to the offender's mindset, the mens rea. A great way to picture this is to think of it like a GPS. The offender has a destination programmed in: sexual intercourse with the minor. They don't just accidentally end up there, they intentionally plot the route to get there, and that route is paved with manipulation and deception. This isn't some misunderstanding, it's a deliberate, calculated plan of action. Now, let's flip the coin over and look at Article 337, or qualified seduction. The victim's age and the physical act are the same, but the method is totally different, and in the eyes of the law, it is way, way more sinister. This crime isn't about creating a counterfeit promise. It's about abusing a very real, very powerful position of trust.
So, the metaphor has to change completely. This is the crime of the abused master key. Think about it. A person in a position of authority, like a teacher, a guardian, a priest, they hold a special kind of key. It's a master key of trust that gives them access to a young person's life, letting them bypass all the normal locks of skepticism and caution we all have. This crime happens when that person uses that master key not to protect and guide, but to unlock and violate.
So, who exactly holds these master keys? Well, the law is super specific. It lists public officials, priests, domestic staff, guardians, teachers, basically anyone who is formally entrusted with a young person's education or care. It even includes a really special case, a sister or a descendant. In that situation, the betrayal of family trust is considered so profound that the victim's age doesn't even matter. That's an abuse of the most fundamental key of all. So why the scary-sounding name? What makes this seduction qualified, and why is it treated so much more seriously? It's because the very foundation of the relationship, trust, has been weaponized. The trust that is supposed to be a shield for the minor is turned into a sword by the offender. It's an aggravating factor because it's a complete perversion of a sacred duty, whether that duty is professional, moral, or family.
Okay, let's put them right next to each other to make it crystal clear. Simple seduction, on one hand, is about actively creating a lie, the counterfeit promise, to manipulate someone's consent. Qualified seduction, on the other hand, is about abusing a pre-existing truth, the inherent trust baked into a relationship, the abused master key. They're both terrible violations, but the law makes it very clear that it sees the betrayal of an existing trust as a much deeper, more damaging wound. Okay, so we've talked about intercourse, but what about other kinds of exploitative acts? Well, this is where our legal architects added another layer of protection to the fortress. And that's where Article 339 comes into play. It basically says, look, if an offender uses the exact same dirty tactics, either the counterfeit promise of deceit or the abused master key of authority, to get consent for lewd or indecent acts that aren't quite intercourse, it's still a crime. The malicious intent is exactly the same as seduction, so the law makes sure to address it. The best way to think about this article is as the law's safety net. It's designed specifically to close a loophole. Imagine an offender, say a teacher, who uses their position to manipulate a student into lewd acts. Without this law, they could try to argue, well, hey, it wasn't technically seduction. This law is the safety net that catches that BS argument and says, nope, the harmful intent, the abuse of trust was identical. Therefore, the violation is just as real. So if we break it down, the act is any kind of lewd behavior. The circumstances are what's critical. They have to perfectly match those of either simple or qualified seduction. And this part is so important. There might be a yes, there might be what looks like consent on the surface, but the law steps in and declares that consent invalid because it was born from manipulation or a power imbalance. So the harm is exactly the same, a deep violation of personal dignity and trust. Okay, let's just hit pause for a second and take stock of where we are. Seduction, in both its forms, and these acts of lasciviousness, they're all fundamentally crimes of personal violation. The offender's motive, no matter how twisted, is about their own personal gratification. But what happens when that entire dynamic shifts? What happens when a person's vulnerability isn't just exploited for one person's satisfaction, but is packaged up, marketed, and sold to satisfy the lust of someone else? This question right here marks a very dark pivot in our legal architecture, moving us out of the realm of personal betrayal and into the cold world of commercial exploitation. And this brings us to a much more heavily fortified section of our legal structure. This one is designed to target the facilitator, the broker, the middleman, the person who makes the exploitation of the young possible. This is Article 340, Corruption of Minors. Now, you have to pay really close attention to the change in motive. The offender here isn't acting to satisfy their own lust. They're acting to satisfy the lust of another person. They become the agent, the promoter, the person who makes the transaction of innocence happen. And the law defines this act super broadly, and for good reason. It's meant to cover the entire supply chain of this kind of corruption. It includes things like promoting or facilitating prostitution, corrupting a minor for someone else's benefit, and even just the acts of inducing, persuading, or arranging these encounters. It targets every single step in the process of turning a human being into a product. At this point, the criminal's role totally transforms. The offender isn't just a seducer anymore. They have become a broker of innocence. They are literally in the business of spotting vulnerability, packaging it, and selling it off to the highest bidder. It is a commercial transaction where the commodity being sold is a person's dignity.
The law reserves a special level of condemnation for public officials who do this. If a public officer, someone who took an oath to protect citizens, becomes a broker of innocence, the penalty isn't just prison. They also face something called temporary absolute disqualification. What does that mean? It means they are immediately fired, and they are permanently banned from ever holding any public office again for the rest of their life. The law is screaming that the betrayal of public trust is so complete, they forfeit the right to ever serve again.
Okay, we've gone from personal violation to facilitating for someone else. Now we arrive at the grim final section of this architecture: exploitation that's been scaled up into an organized, profitable, and systemic business. This is Article 3041, which targets what the law calls the white slave trade, using terminology from the era it was written. Today, we just call it what it is: human trafficking. And the scope of this law is massive. It doesn't just go after one person corrupting one minor, it criminalizes the entire business ecosystem of prostitution. And you have to appreciate the change in scale here. This law isn't just prosecuting a single act, it's designed to dismantle an entire industry. It views sexual exploitation not as a series of isolated, tragic events, but as a commercial enterprise, with managers, recruiters, and people getting rich off of it. So the law's response is to attack the whole business model. The law identifies three core pillars of this criminal industry. Think of them like departments in a twisted corporation. First, engaging in the business. That's the CEO or operations manager, the pimp or brothel owner running the show. Second, profiting from prostitution. That's the CFO, anyone taking a cut or benefiting financially. And third, enlisting others. That's the HR department, the recruiters whose job it is to bring new people into this horrible trade. So let's bring back our GPS metaphor for the offender's mindset. The destination is now crystal clear: profit, cold, hard cash. And the route they knowingly and willfully programmed to get there is running a sexual exploitation business. This is the highest level of criminal intent we've seen: a cold, calculated business decision to build an enterprise on the backs of other human beings. Wow, we have journeyed through this entire architectural blueprint, from a simple counterfeit promise all the way to a full-blown criminal industry. So now, let's step back and look at the design of justice itself. Because the penalties for these crimes, they're not random. They tell a powerful story about our society's values. Just look at this blueprint of penalties. You see simple seduction down at the bottom? It carries a penalty called arresto mayor, a lighter sentence, up to 6 months. But then look what happens with qualified seduction, abusing that trust. The penalty jumps way up to prison correctional, a much more serious sentence, up to around 4 years. And by the time we get to corruption of minors and the white slave trade, we're in a whole different league: prison mayor, with sentences that can go all the way up to 12 years. You can see a clear ladder of severity just in the names of the penalties. This chart just makes it pop. It visualizes the law's value system perfectly. Simple seduction is that small bar on the left. Qualified seduction is significantly bigger, right? It shows you how much more seriously the law takes the abuse of trust. But then, just look at that enormous leap to the white slave trade. It is an exponential jump. This chart makes it absolutely undeniable what the law considers the most disgusting of these offenses: the systematic, for-profit exploitation of people. So, in the end, the prison sentence acts like a measuring stick. It's measuring the depth of the betrayal, from a simple lie all the way to abusing a sacred trust. And it's measuring the scale of the harm, from a single individual violation to an organized industry that ruins countless lives. The punishment is designed to fit the crime, not just in what was done, but in its moral and societal weight. We've seen how the law has meticulously built this fortress of statutes, with every article adding a new wall, a new layer of defense. It's an impressive design, and it's all aimed at protecting basic human dignity. But that leaves us with one last, vital question. This legal fortress, it exists on paper, but in the real world, a fortress is only as strong as the people who stand guard. So the question for all of us is, what is our role in guarding the gate?